Earth. Crusades. AD 1200. Chapter 1. 1200 AD. Earth. Subject: Chris Stormberg. Status: Hibernation. Command: Reactivation. Within minutes, Chris woke from his stasis. He felt a little more worn and aged than he usually did after the stasis revival. Normally, he felt strong and refreshed, almost 25 again, as he had felt when he first exited the ATS on his 4th year on this planet. He instructed the all-terrain skimmer to expel him, so he could stretch out this now considerably older, if not fully rejuvenated, body. Nothing like a good stretch and scratch after a long sleep, Chris thought to himself, rubbing a particularly itchy patch of skin on his arm. Unable to comply. Currently en route to Guardian Station, replied the ATS. The mind-link communication still caught him by surprise. Docking. What year is it? Asked Chris. 1210 AD. Docked. Expel initiated. Chris, standing in the cargo hold, started to recall the time before he had last entered the ATS's stasis chamber. He remembered taking the last of the weapon modules to the pyramids down on Earth from this very bay. I must be on the Guardian space station, thought Chris. But first, a few stretching exercises. He interlocked his fingers and then inverted his hands so the locked fingers faced palm out. Then slowly raised his arms vertically. Whilst performing a few more stretching exercises, he remembered that it had been a close call when the ATS was almost absorbed by the Egyptian pyramid's weapon. The construction process had started almost immediately as soon as he had placed his hands on the activation panel. The weapon had begun to transform and create itself at startling speed. He shuddered as he recalled the unearthly screech the ATS had made as it was being absorbed by the pyramid's weapon. They had to spend a few months down in the Atlantean pyramid just to allow the ATS to recuperate and get its energy back up to full power. The technology that powered the ATS was advanced, but to regenerate its energy source from just seawater took time. He wondered what would have happened had the ATS not made it out of the pyramid's chamber. Those damn guardians should have warned him, or at least communicated the construction process to his ATS. Chris worried that one day they might forget to give him some vital piece of minuscule information, trivial to them, that would be the death of them both, and with that, the end of mankind as well. Thank goodness that was over, and all the pyramid weapons were now complete and ready to be activated. All he needed to do was to activate the pyramid's weapons through one of the active control panels in a completed pyramid, like the one in the Atlantic pyramid. Some of the transport portals which were used to get to the control panels inside the other pyramids had been damaged, either by natural occurrences, treasure seekers, or during the submergence process. He should have taken more precautions to ensure that the weapons activation panels had been protected. Still, the imagination of the human criminal mind knows no bounds when it comes to the purported treasure harvest. They were lucky to get away with the little damage that had occurred to the dormant weapon modules. As he had done countless times, he made his way to the meeting hall where he normally got his information from the Guardians. Information? Ha! More like instruction, thought Chris. And now here is your assignment, Agent Man. Call it Mission Impossible, if you will, he thought sarcastically. Still, I always seem to get the job done. Chris mentally patted himself on the back. The wall parted with a hum, and he entered. He was about to walk to his designated position in the center of the sphere-shaped conference room when he noted that the large-headed, Moa-like guardians were already there. Chris, we are concerned. A voice spoke to him via his mind link. Events are unfolding that we cannot foresee. The final result is now uncertain. There are 3 religious factions in Europe, Africa, and the Middle Asia. They are all fighting over a city called Jerusalem. This war is not a new one. In fact, it has been waged in some form or another for over a millennium. In this particular war, the Crusades, as it is named, the Christians have united and are fighting the Muslims, whilst the Judeans stand back and watch, waiting to see who the victor will be. Each believes that they have the right to occupy and rule the city. To each of the three religious groups, Jerusalem has significant religious importance. This war is not in mankind's best interests, as it will result in a never-ending conflict between the three groups. As such, mankind will never be unified to stand against the Xhoseti when they arrive in AD 2492. For now, you are to only observe the unfolding of the war between them, but later, when they are all but exhausted, you may intervene. It is our hope that they will eventually become weary of all the carnage and bloodshed, and that they will find a way to live together peacefully and share this city that means so much to them all. Failing that, you will find a way for them to coexist together, if not in peace and harmony, then at least in tolerance of each other. That is your mission. With that, the Guardians, as one, turned and left the conference room. Chris, mouth ajar, stood there rooted to the spot where he stood. His legs felt as if his morph suit had absorbed a ton of water and sent it straight down to his lower extremities, making it impossible for him to move. Normally, Chris was required to wait for the Guardians' dramatic entrance. So this time, with them waiting anxiously for him to arrive, something was amiss. Their demeanor made him suspicious. Something of major consequence must be happening to have made them so uneasy. He had almost smelt the panic emanating through the mind link. Well, it's about time someone else started feeling the pressure. Good. It must be something to do with the future patterns of Chaos Machine being unable to tell them what to do next. They now have to think and act for themselves, he said out loud, hoping the Guardians were eavesdropping. This kind of influence is exactly what he did best, so it would be better if they left the meddling to him. If they wanted to finish the job themselves, they could step in and merely take over, especially after he had set in motion all the right trigger points. Still, their future predictions had more often than not come true, and it did not hurt to have that kind of information available. Most handy, in fact, Chris said quietly to himself. Forewarned is forearmed, as they say in the Space Academy. Sultan Saladin of the Muslim Ayyubids was sitting in his newly constructed palace enjoying a bowl of black tea sweetened with some of the local honey. The battle to take Bethlehem had been particularly costly, both to his Saracen army and in financial terms. But it was worth it. He now had the world at his feet and could prove once and for all that Allah was the greatest. Who could deny that God was on his side when he had swept aside the Christian army garrisoning Jerusalem? Admittedly, he had surrounded the city and starved them half to death first. What a joy to see them desperate to break out from under his ring of steel and charge headlong into his hail of arrows. What a sight! The sky had almost turned dark with the armor-piercing, steel-headed arrows he had unleashed, smiting those infidels. His archers had done a fantastic job, releasing all their arrows in a matter of minutes. That had been his instruction. Let them all fly and just remove them from the dead and dying after the battle. Next, his skilled horsemen had charged with swords flashing in the sunlight. The roar they had made, screaming, "God is great!" and "Death to all infidels!" as they charged in to finish off those poor starving Christian knights. Ha! What a sight they were! They were foolish to believe that he would not come for his revenge when he was told how the devoted pilgrims, on their way to Mecca, were massacred by some idiot Christian soldiers under the command of Chatillon. The great crusader, he calls himself. Well, not so great now. When the walls were breached, he spared those still alive inside the city, save for one soul. The great crusader. Chatillon's dried blood stained his scimitar, which now hung as a trophy in his entrance hall wall, along with Chatillon's head on a pike for the dogs to pick at and slowly tear apart. Every now and then he would gaze up at the scimitar, made by the strong arm of his father. His lips would curl into a smile as he remembered giving Chatillon that fatal blow. The trickling water running down the purpose-built staircase banister always brought him back from his dreamy thoughts and gave him a feeling of immense calm. It was while sitting, having tea in this very room, that he decided to allow the Christians to remain in the city and not to be persecuted. The Crusader cross on the dome of the rock had to come down, though. He almost changed his mind on sparing the Christians with that symbol hanging up there, casting its menacing shadow down and onto his head. Although he would allow them to remain in Jerusalem and prevent them being persecuted by his soldiers, That amnesty did not apply to the invading Christian armies spread across the Holy Land. Next, he would kick Christianity completely out of Palestine. His army was already in training, and the supply wagons were getting fuller with every day that passed. There was just one cloud on the horizon: Richard. His reputation for winning battle was as fierce as that of a starving Nubian lion, very dangerous when cornered and insatiable when he sensed his prey weakening. No wonder he was called the Lionheart. His spies informed him that the Christian army was camped near Şurikli in the northwest of Syria. They were low on supplies and must be desperate by now for resources. Anyone who had experienced the pangs of hunger and the scratchy rasp of dehydration as one scraped a swollen tongue over split and bleeding lips would know that a few more days of that torture would force any soldier to desert his master, no matter what heaven had been promised by that usurper in the Vatican. He had sent messengers to bribe the local tribes and villagers as the Christians traveled through their lands. They were not to help with any resupply of Richard's wagons. So far, so good. By the time the army arrived in Lebanon, they would be starving and weak. An easy victory would be achieved. He would even spare their lives if they converted to Islam. Nevertheless, it was time to show these Christians just who was Lord of Palestine. Saladin called for his captains to join him. Time to action his plan. They would ride out and meet Richard at Acre and put an end to this Christian scourge once and for all. But first, a bit more tea. They can wait, he thought. A few more days will not affect the outcome. It may even be beneficial to wait longer so the Christians are even weaker, a bit more emaciated. A smile spread across his tanned, handsome features. Just outside the forest of Şurikli, the Crusaders had made camp. The sun was about to set, and the chill of the night starting to clasp the men's bones. Hunger had a way of accentuating any hardship. Christian Crusaders Hermann and Gerard were sitting by their campfire waiting for the order to march onwards to the Holy Land. Rations had been dished out to all the soldiers in the camp, a quarter loaf of bread and a quart flagon of wine. Without protein each day, they got weaker and weaker. How were they to fight the Saracens when the time came? They needed supplies, and fast, fresh meat first and foremost. The leaders of this crusade, Richard and Philip, were sitting in their tents enjoying a roast antelope, freshly caught and roasted over an open fire. Hermann could still smell the fat from the dead animal on the smoldering coals. His stomach growled with the olfactory invasion, his senses heightening the hunger pangs emanating from his stomach. How much longer could they continue like this? Thought Hermann. That night, he and Gerard snuck away from the encampment, intent on finding something to eat, either from a local farm or in the forest. They were creeping around stealthily when they came across a rabbit warren. Hunkering down to wait for one of the hares to come out and root around for a tuber of some sort, they saw a young man tending to his traps. Sneaking around behind him to see what he had caught, Gerard stepped on a twig. It snapped. Gerard froze as a deer would when trying to remain undiscovered. Startled, the young man dropped the young hare he had in his hands, which bounded away into the forest. From the shine of the moonlight, the young man could make out the dirty, off-white tunics covering the two observers' chainmail. On the breast of the tunic he could just make out the dark image of a Christian cross. These must be the Crusaders that he had been warned to stay clear of. He could not help with any food or drink for these Christian invaders. To do so would mean certain death for him and his family. This instruction came directly from the village elders. Ahmed turned and started to run. Hermann saw the startled young man trying to make a break for it. Before he knew it, he had the dagger in his hand and had thrown it into the man's back and straight through the boy's heart. The runner made a grunt and then fell to the ground, dead. Shaking with hunger, Gerard went to the dead man and rifled through his pockets looking for food, maybe a piece of bread or cheese. All he found was a tinderbox with a bit of flint in it. Finding nothing else, he turned to Hermann. They both knew what had to be done. Stringing the corpse up in a tree, Hermann gutted the boy as one would a deer or a fish while Gerard started a fire. Digging a pit, Gerard lined it with rocks found close by, using only dried sticks and dried twigs. Smoke was to be avoided at all costs, as they did not want to be discovered doing this grisly, unchristian deed. He struck the flint taken from the young boy's tinderbox. It took a few strikes, but then the dried tree moss he had gathered caught and burst into